Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 232. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author R.B. Kelly about her debut science fiction novel, Edge of Heaven, and its sequel, On the Brink. Rachael admits that Edge of Heaven was a long time in the making. She began the first draft of the story when she was only 15 years old. Always a fan of Terry Pratchett, Rachael loves his notion of inspiration particles sleeting through the universe. What was her own inspiration particle for these books? An imaginary vision of a city built on top of another city. A longtime fan of speculative fiction and deeply impressed by the movie Blade Runner, Rachael set about trying to write the story surrounding that city on top of a city. Edge of Heaven went through too many iterations for Rachael to count, but she always knew it was the story she was meant to write. In this episode, I'll chat with Rachael about her writing journey, how her books explore the idea of what it means to be human, and why it is crucial for her to write all of the senses into her stories, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Rachael Kelly, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. I'm delighted to be here, Stacey. Thank you.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your two new sci-fi novels, Edge of Heaven and On the Brink, both of which you write under the pen name R.B. Kelly.
Yes.
Let's start with Edge of Heaven, book one. What inspired you to write this book? Tell us a little bit about it, and I'm curious about the inspiration for it.
Okay, so this book was a very, very long time in the making. I actually wrote the first draft of this when I was 15 years old. I am no longer 15 years old and haven't been for quite some time. So it started with an image, actually. And you know those images that come at you out of absolutely nowhere? And you know, it's never a very satisfying answer to the question of where did you get the inspiration for this book? Because I was literally sitting in the back of my dad's car and all of a sudden my brain went, what if there was a city that was built on top of another city? And I have no idea where that came from. So it sort of stuck with me. And one of those ideas that kind of percolates and kind of develops, because, you know, I thought, well, what if there was a city? Why would somebody build a city on top of a city? What would be the reasons why that might happen? And I had such a clear image of it that I knew that I wanted to find the story that was connected to this. I love to think, I'm a huge fan of Terry Pratchett. I have been since my early teens. And I love this idea of inspiration particles sleeting through the universe. And some people are just receptive to these inspiration particles. And I like to think I was hit by an inspiration particle that day, but I needed to find the story that went along with that inspiration particle. So it was around about this time that I had my great sci-fi awakening, I suppose. I grew up in a household which was just full of books, and they were books on every single subject under the sun. My dad's always been a big speculative fiction fan, so we had lots and lots of spec fic books on the shelves, and we watched Star Trek and all of that. You know, it was a very spec fic friendly household. But I never really considered myself to be a spec fic fan until I discovered in quick succession Terry Pratchett and Ben Elton. Now, I think a lot of people don't tend to associate Ben Elton with speculative fiction, but in the early 1990s, he was writing quite a few books in that area, and specifically what we would now call climate fiction. And both of these two pillars of my literary influences kind of came together at the same time that this inspiration particle hit me. And from there, it sort of expanded outwards. The next thing to come was the heroine, Danae Grant. And the more I got to know her, the more I got to know that this was really the story that I wanted to be telling. It was a story that kind of evolved around her personality and why she was so secretive and why she was so isolated, and kind of expanded outwards from there. I also watched Blade Runner around this time for the first time ever. And in fact, I like to say early drafts of this novel were basically Blade Runner fan fiction. I was deeply impressed by Blade Runner the first time I saw it. I should say the first few times I saw it. I'm not the sort of person that watches something once. I tend to really go all in my fandoms. So from there, I started having all these big thoughts about, well, identity and what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to be the self and how does one recognize the self? What constitutes the self? And from there, it just kind of built and built and built. I was very interested around this time. I mean, I think the whole idea of climate change was starting to really kind of pick up in the popular cultural consciousness in the early 90s as well. So that was always something that informed the development of the novel. But it went through so many iterations, I can't even count now. I just always knew that this was the one. I've been writing since I was old enough to hold a pen. I'm the kind of kid that was always buried in a book or telling stories. I used to staple bits of paper together and write stories on one side of it and then draw pictures on the other. These would be my novels that I would hand out to people. I mean, I wrote what I laughingly now, but I was very serious about it at the time. When I was 8 years old, I wrote my first quote unquote novel about a talking pony. So that's the kind of kid that I was. And all of this, I always knew that Edge of Heaven would be the first one. I just kept coming back to it. It was the story that wouldn't leave me alone. And I mean, those early drafts were objectively very, very bad. I mean, it was my first attempt at writing a grown-up novel. And at the age of 15, I wasn't really equipped to be writing a grown-up novel. I thought the way you wrote a grown-up novel was that you put lots of swearing in it. And so my mum, who doesn't read science fiction but reads everything I write, bless her, she read it, the earlier drafts, and she went, "Oh, there's quite a lot of swearing in this, isn't there?" And I went, "Yeah, it's a grown-up novel, Mum." So obviously that version, that still exists somewhere on a floppy disk somewhere. I'm that old. It's the software that I wrote it on no longer exists. There's no way to look at it, and that's a good thing. That's a very good thing, that's completely inaccessible to human eyes forevermore. But it sort of evolved, and I just kept coming back and editing and re-editing and re-editing. And because it had the element from very early on, it had the pandemic element to it. When swine flu hit in 2009, it got another lease of life. And that's when I thought, I bless my poor innocent pre-2020 self. I thought, oh, look at me, I'm doing research in real time. I'm watching how a pandemic evolves. Yes, okay, Rachael. It's a good thing I didn't know what was coming in 11 years. But and because that was such a huge part of this kind of, it was a fear that I'd had for years. I mean, we were always told that there was a pandemic coming and to be prepared for it. And I mean, my great-grandmother, obviously I never knew her, but she died in the Spanish flu epidemic. So there were stories about the toll that pandemics take. And the more we kept being told that, it's a question of when rather than if, the more I started to kind of subsume that fear by writing about it. So the version that I got after 2009 was actually pretty close to the version that ended up being published.
Oh, wow.
It still needed a couple of revisions, and I had two wonderful friends. Now, this is a monster of a book, okay? I think the original draft of it was almost 200,000 words. It's such a ridiculous length for a novel. But two friends of mine volunteered to read it for me. And honestly, I mean, the amount of work that would have gone into that for them, I could never, ever express my gratitude fully for that, because the revisions they suggested on the basis of that read through, when I did those revisions, that was the version that found a publisher.
Wow.
So a long evolution, but we got there in the end.
Wow. Do those friends of yours still read what you write? Or was that it?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, you know what happens once you have kids, you sort of you don't get in touch with people as often as you should probably. And I certainly don't ask them on the occasions when we're speaking, by the way, have you read my stuff? I hope they do, but but I may have used up all of my reading Rachael's work credits at that point.
That's a big ask, 200,000 words.
It's a huge ask. It's an insane amount of words to get somebody to read for friendship.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about, before we move on to book 2, I want to talk about the setting for this book, because obviously you've worked on it for a very long time.
Yeah.
I'm curious, one, how you went about creating this world, what you thought about, what was important to you, and did those things change over time? So what you ended up with in the version that got published, how close was it to that initial vision that you saw sitting in the back of your dad's car?
Yeah, I think it was actually pretty close. The tech evolved, obviously, because again, the difference between 1990 tech and 2016, when the first print of it came out, there's a lot of different capabilities that I was able to introduce to the world. But the city stayed very similar. I shifted the location of it because, as I say, it was Blade Runner fan fiction originally, and it was set in Los Angeles, the original iteration, which was a city I've been to LA since, but I'd never visited. So there was absolutely no reason for it to be set in Los Angeles. Why would anybody build another layer on top of Los Angeles anyway? All of these questions were questions that I didn't think to ask myself at the age of 15. But as the novel evolved, I started to think a bit more, well, why would this be true? But the aesthetics of it and the idea of these sort of honeycomb districts, all with their own identity, those were very fixed from very, very early drafts. And I think they kind of evolved as I traveled more. But each of those districts had their own identity from the get-go. And I always envisaged it as a kind of a cultural melting pot, a place where identity is sacrosanct because you've been transplanted, not necessarily because you wanted to be transplanted either. You've been transplanted almost against your will. And you're trying to hold on to those pillars of your identity, the idea of home, to capture and hold on to it. So I'm not in any way artistically gifted. I struggle with stick figures. So the idea of drawing a map, it was never likely to be a very detailed map. But I did start to put the bare bones of it together, just to give myself a reference point, I guess, and to know that, if we were talking about going from Punta Oeste to Sucre Sacre, how does one do that? Is it legitimate to say that I went west, or should I be going east? And just to keep myself right, because I don't have that kind of visual imagination at all. And what I always need to do when I'm creating a space is to make sure that I get all of the senses in place. And I think to me, sometimes that's almost more important than having the visual in place. The visual, obviously, I want to make sure that the reader can see the world that I'm walking my characters through, and I want to be able to see the world I'm walking my characters through. But more than that, I want them to know what else is going on around them. Sound, to me, it's an important marker of space, but scent. There are places that I swear I could recognize by scent alone. And I remember reading that actually scent is the sense that's most closely connected to the memory impulse in the brain. So it's one of the senses that can most easily evoke memory, and not even necessarily consciously. So I always wanted to know, it sounds ridiculous in this dirty, dark city, what can you smell? It wasn't so much the drains. I thought drains are probably a big part of that anyway, but it's the other stuff that goes in. It's the food scent, it's the perfume of are there flowers, are there what are the cooking scents, all of that stuff that makes up that sort of bouquet. And each one of them seemed to have their own distinct scent profile, which made each district feel like its own space.
Interesting. So you finally decided upon the city that was going to be the basis for your city that you would build upon. How long did that take before you finally settled on, okay, here's where it is, this is what it now looks like? Was that still evolving up until that last draft?
It actually was. It shifted location between the penultimate draft and the final draft.
Wow.
So soon before that final draft that, in fact, In the first run of publications, the blurb made reference to the previous location of the city because I'd forgotten that I changed it. So given all of the research that I put into all of the tech and all of the climate issues and the population and all that sort of fluvial patterns, it's kind of amazing that I didn't think to check, is it reasonable to put a city in this spot, until literally the very last minute I went, oh no, it is actually not. That's not a good place to put it. Let's move it somewhere else, which is actually a reasonable place for it. So that was a very, very last minute. Nothing else about the city shifted, but it moved to a completely different part of France.
Oh, wow.
The penultimate draft.
Oh my gosh. Okay. That would make me so nervous.
Yeah,
Just
well,
that idea.
I think it was all bound up with everything else that was going on at that moment. I was like, yeah, that's fine. And then completely forgot that I hadn't updated the blurb.
Well, let's talk about the characters, because you mentioned Danae early on, right? And that's the story sort of built around her once you started to get a clearer picture of her.
Yeah.
Did she change very much from sort of those early days? And if she did, how did you go about deciding ultimately who she was and what her story would look like?
So she hasn't changed that much in terms of her goals and her worldview and her outlook. If anything, she became more introverted as I understood her better and I understood what was at stake for her. And I understood that it was more likely that she would be very much more closed off than initially I had thought. I had originally created her. She'd always had these without wanting to cause any to give any spoilers. She'd always had these powers that she has in the completed version of it, but I hadn't explored that in earlier versions to their logical conclusion. So it was always very important to me to make her independent and to give her agency and to make her very much, the beating heart of the novel. In earlier iterations, I had let her be saved more often than I think was reasonable. Now, I don't think it's necessary for the strong heroine to never, ever have to accept help. I think that pushes it out the other side. But for somebody like Danae, not only would she not want to receive help, but she also would very, very rarely need it, because she has resources that are not available to the majority of women. So the more I understood her, the more introverted she became, the more she shut herself off from the world. But I think also that was a process of discovery for me. I hadn't realized how much of me was in Danae when I started to write it. Now, I'm not saying that I am in any way shutting myself off from the world, but I am much more introverted than I knew as a teenager. And my process of self-discovery has involved a lot more understanding of the reasons why I would be introverted and why I would shun social situations. And the more I understood that about me, the more okay I felt about allowing her to take that to sort of greater and greater extremes. I like people a lot more than Danae does. But other than that, I get her. And I think, I get the lines of connection between the two of us a lot more than I did. I think every character a writer writes has some part of the author's soul in them. And I don't know why it took me so long to see that, Danae being probably the favourite character I've ever written. The reason for that is because I was writing a superpowered version of myself and giving that person permission to be unapologetically who she needed to be. So a lot of it was about kind of accepting myself as and allowing Danae to be who she needed to be as she evolved.
Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about her journey, because she appears also in the second book. So if you don't mind, give the listeners maybe a little bit of a taste of what happens in book one, and then let's sort of lead into, without too many spoilers, lead into book two, On the Brink.
Sure. So in book one, Danae is living alone in the bi-level city of Creobas, and she has been holding on to a secret that if it ever gets out, it will end her life. And into this mix her disaster is that she falls in love. She has been determinedly shutting everybody out for as long as her last remaining relative has recently passed away, and that's her completely on her own. In many ways, that's a bonus for her because she needs to isolate herself. But this is a world that is, it's a post-conflict world. Well, a post-conflict world where they are evolving out of conflict, I suppose. The conflict is still very much there. It's very much present. It's a dangerous world. It's an unpredictable world. And because of the nature of the city where they live, it's rife with disease. Now, it's 22nd century medicine is available to them, so they tend to be a bit more complacent about it until one disease crops up that they actually don't know what to do with anymore. And it starts to spread like wildfire through the city. And in the midst of all of this, Danae disastrously has fallen in love and she has to make a decision. Is she prepared to risk everything for the love that she's found, or does she keep herself safe and stay hidden? So by the time we meet her in book 2, she's made her decision and she's living with the cost of that decision. So she has survived, obviously, because, sorry, that is a huge spoiler, but she has survived and she's obviously in book 2. She is trying to rebuild her life. Book 2, she's actually left Creobas and she is now living on an orbital city. It's an orbital factory city. So again, climate change has pushed a lot of agriculture off the surface of the earth. And because it's speculative fiction and I wanted to have cities in the sky, that's what I have. So I've got these orbital cities, which are centres of agriculture and centres of industry. But they are owned by global conglomerates. They're a good place to live. Well, they're a safe-ish place to live in that you are going to be housed, you're going to be fed, you have a certain job security there, but equally you're basically owned by the company because the company has say over whether or not you stay there. And that's where Danae is when we meet her in the second novel, and she's trying to come to terms with the decisions that she's made and come to terms with the results of those decisions. And it was really, really important to me that I didn't dismiss her trauma from the first book, because I've seen that happen where characters are put in a situation where they have to make an impossible choice. And that choice results in an immense amount of trauma and some really, really terrible outcomes for them. And then it's kind of brushed under the carpet because the next installment in the story requires them to, business as usual, keep moving forward. But in fact, that kind of trauma it doesn't go away. And if you deal with it the way Danae is programmed to do, which is pretend it's not there, push it all down, you're not dealing with it at all. It's festering and it's going to become more and more difficult to manage. So I really wanted to look at what life looked like for her on the other side of that decision, and then to give her an opportunity to get to know a bit more about herself. Because I think one of the reasons why she finds it so hard to forgive herself for her secret in book 1 is because she has no point of reference for what that self might look like and how that self could be anything other than what she's been told it is. But when she meets Adam, she has the opportunity then to connect with some of her heritage and some of the past that she's been denied, and to get a better understanding of what it means to be human in the way that Danae is human. So I really wanted to explore that. I'd also obviously left Edge of Heaven in a bit of a cliffhanger, and I wanted to see what happened next. But I also wanted to give Danae's story and give her arc what I felt was the resolution it deserved.
Was it always planned as more than one book?
No. I have trouble talking of it as a sequel as well, because I know that a sequel is literally just, what happens next in this story. But I don't think of the two of them as being connected in any significant way other than the fact that it's what happens next to this character. I always knew I would write more stories in this universe. And in fact, I am writing another story in this universe at the moment. I've got more planned. But it was never intended to be a multi-book arc. And while I think On the Brink makes more sense if you've read Edge of Heaven, I feel like the two of them, well, in my mind, they're kind of standalone novels that just feature the same character.
Okay. And then plans for going forward. Do you have these mapped out either on paper or in your head, or Is it a case of whichever idea seems loudest, that's just what you'll work on next?
Well, I have been wanting to tell the prequel for the longest time. So the story of how Danae came to live the life that she's living. There are some references to her birth identity in Edge of Heaven. And I'm trying to think, have I put any in on the Brink or not? It's terrible when you don't know what's the content of your own novel, isn't it? Um, but I really wanted to tell that story. So I am about halfway through writing that story, but then another story came up and wanted to be told as well. So I've got that story and it's about halfway completed. And I'm planning out another story that theoretically takes place in that universe, but can be read again as a standalone and doesn't feature Danae at all in this case.
Okay. Okay. So this world that you've created, do you think it's big enough to house stories of different characters and crossover references and all of that? Is that kind of, do you think you will live in this universe for a while with your writing?
I think so. I've done such a lot of work in getting to know this universe, and I've tried to understand the history. I've got I have a huge document that outlines the history year by year by year, leading up from the year of writing all the way up to 2119 when Edge of Heaven takes place. So I feel very immersed in the future history of this space. I'm also with all of my writing, it's character that interests me, but in this instance, it's specifically how the world that exists, how it changes character and how character has to adapt to that world. So I think there's scope for lots of different stories and experiences to be told. There are lots of different ways in which this world, this universe creates conflict for characters of all kinds of different backgrounds and socioeconomic classes. It's a different space. It's a space that I hope is recognizable as a potential logical few next steps down the line from where we are. I think it could be. I think it's probably that the tech has advanced too quickly for it to be as near future as I've made it. But I think that a lot of where we are at the moment, this could be a logical next step, and there's not too many steps between where we are now and the outcome of some decisions that influence the world of Edge of Heaven.
Interesting. Do you watch the news? Do you pay attention to current events and think, oh gosh, that's really close to what I'm envisioning?
So I I do sometimes watch the news. I used to watch the news almost religiously, and then during the lockdown period, I just had to switch it off because it was just so relentlessly terrifying. But what I did find very unsettling, I suppose, was the experience of going to the mass testing centres during COVID and going for my first vaccinations once the vaccine had been developed for COVID, because it was basically exactly what I had written. It looked like I was sitting there in this space going, this is almost exactly how I described it. And the protests against, lockdown and the resistance to lockdown and the terror that's surrounded and the political decision making that goes around lockdown and the economic fallout and the mental health fallout of lockdown, all of that is in my novel. And I wrote this before swine flu didn't look like this. The swine flu pandemic didn't look like the COVID pandemic. I was thinking, what happens if this is a pandemic that actually does shut the world down? When lo and behold, when it happened, thinking, this is uncomfortably close. I used to joke around the time that it was released. Next book, I'm going to predict the lottery numbers, because there's a lot of this is really uncomfortably familiar.
Goodness. Do you ever end up writing something and think, oh, I really hope this doesn't happen?
Not so much these days.
Okay.
I'm really super interested in solar punk at the moment. I published my first solar punk short story last year. My biggest problem with solar punk is where's the conflict? Because it's it's hopeful fiction, it's hopeful science fiction, and it envisages a world in which, yeah, we have pretty much messed everything up, but not irrevocably. And now we found the solutions, and this is what it looks like on the other side of this difficult technological adolescence that we're in at the moment. This is what it looks like when we finally get it right, assuming that we don't actually destroy ourselves en route. So I would not mind if my solar punk predictions come true, because they're quite nice.
Well, let's hope. We'll keep writing that.
Yes.
Because if your writing is prophetic, maybe that's where you need to be.
That would be great. Although, unfortunately, it does kind of require that some form of apocalypse has happened and we're on the other side of it usually. But that's neither here nor there. We've survived, and that's the main
minor
thing.
Detail.
Minor detail.
Well, you mentioned short stories. So you've written a number of short stories. I'm curious how you feel about that form of storytelling as compared to the novel, because you've written like novel to the extreme, 200,000 words, right? So you've gone basically both ends.
Yeah.
Do you find you prefer one or the other, or that one is easier, or that you struggle with one more than the other?
I think I find short stories more difficult than novels. Now, obviously, I've published more short stories than novels, but I find the form easier with novels. I mean, obviously, I'd just like to clarify that the novel that was published was not 200,000 words.
Right.
It's significantly shorter than that. It's still a bit of a beast, but it's not as long as that. However, I mean, it's clearly I don't have trouble with lots and lots and lots of words. That's something that comes more naturally to me. I find it difficult to tell, not difficult, but more challenging, I suppose, to tell a coherent and complete short story, or a story within the short story parameters. My short stories are often quite long, in that you'll be unsurprised to hear 200,000 word novel, but my short stories are often quite long in their initial draft, and then it's a process of chopping it right back. Generally speaking, when I'm getting an idea for a story, it is a novel length story, just because so much information arrives over the course of developing that idea. However, there are just some stories that arrive that are clearly short stories, and I kind of just, it sounds really, I don't know, very authory thing to say, but I just allow them to be the length that they need to be, because it feels very natural that some of them are short and some of them are long.
Yeah. Do you have other goals for yourself as a writer? I mean, it sounds like stories, other than just trying to write all the stories that come to you, do you have other goals, other things you would like to do or try?
That's a great question. I don't know necessarily that I have goals other than just to keep doing what I'm doing. As life changes, it does become more difficult to make enough space for writing, particularly during the very crazy. I have 2 young children, so it does become more difficult. So what I think my goals at the moment are just to continue to make writing a priority, to continue to make space for it. I would I have so many ideas here that are clamoring for expression, and I would love to think that I'm going to be able to make the space and to keep telling those stories. Obviously, I would love to have a story picked up for a streaming service. I've always thought Edge of Heaven would make a really nice sort of mini series type thing, not so much a movie, but that would be a dream, I suppose. But in terms of goals, it sounds very boring, but I suppose I would love to just keep doing what I'm doing. I'm very happy with where I find myself as an author. I want to make sure that I keep writing stories that people want to read.
Right. Well, fingers crossed that you get to keep doing that. And
hope so.
Let's hope people find them. So that leads me to my next question. Where can people go to find information about you and your books, new releases, new short stories, that sort of thing?
So, everything is on my website, which is www.rbkelly.co.uk. My books are available. They're in independent bookstores, which obviously I love it when people support independent bookstores. They're also available directly from my publisher, Newcon Press. I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook. I am on Instagram. I am technically on Pinterest. I'm still working out what a Pinterest is and what it's for, but I'm technically on there. And yeah, I've got a newsletter, and if people are interested in chatting about anything to do with any of the subjects that clearly obsess me, I always love to get emails from people just wanting to chat about science fiction or any of the stuff that I find interesting in these books.
Good. And if people want to purchase a copy of the book, best place to go is your publisher?
Yeah, Newcon Press. Yeah. It's also, I suppose Newcon is UK based, so if you're outside of the UK, then Amazon is probably the best. But I do tend to try and push people towards purchasing direct wherever possible.
Good. Well, Rachael, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast, and I want to wish you luck with Edge of Heaven and On the Brink and all the other stuff that you have planned for this universe. We will look forward to all of that. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, Stacey. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.